Okay, so welcome so much to this Candide talk. I think it was Kat who asked, who triggered the question about maybe we could hold such a talk. And thank you for asking that question, because from my background, I'm like many of you from the software world, technology world. So 20 years ago, this whole thing was a mystery to me as well. And luckily, we have Waheed on our team, who does not find this mysterious at all. I'm less mystified, but so I will be not saying so much today, but might come in a few comments from my non-scholarly angle. But today we're going to talk about scientific names demystified. It's a bit of an ambitious title. Some of you might still be demystified after this, hopefully not. That's why we record it as well. So if we sort of go slowly to begin with, but at the end, because we did a vote on this and a lot of people want us to go in depth at the end, go a bit geeky. So there'll be a bit of, complex things at the end, but hopefully, hopefully you enjoy this and take out your popcorn and let's roll film. Thank you very much, Waheed.
Thanks, Havard. And thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, we're really excited to hopefully give you a whistle-stop tour of the wonderful language of plants and plant taxonomy. So we've got, as Havard said, half an hour to talk through this, and then we'll have probably about 15 minutes or so at the end where we go into some geeky topics, which you're, of course, welcome to stop by and listen. So we'll kick off proceedings, and hopefully, if you've got any questions, feel free to shout out or save them at the end. So, what's in a scientific name? So as many of you may know, actually, that scientific names are actually strictly something that humans have invented. And because of that, actually, and because it's a strictly human invention, it means that names are subject to change as our education evolves and our understanding of plants evolves. So whether we learn about plants in terms of their leaves or their flowers, or even more hardcore things like their biochemistry and also their DNA sequences, really the science of plants and botany, it's always evolving. So that's one of the reasons why this is quite a tricky topic to get into. And generally it's known as plant taxonomy. And that is actually just simply the discipline that underlies this whole system of classification. And this system is really there so that plants can be organized and identified very clearly. And in the old days, if you like, plants were known by very long descriptions, and these can get very unwieldy very quickly. So as you can see for this example, a plant label could have looked something like this: Plantago folius ovato lanceolatus pubescentibus spica cylindricus scapo teriti. And that sounds like lorem ipsum to many of you, but in its literal translation, it means it's a plantain with pubescent, which means hairy, ovate lanceolate leaves, which is the shape of the leaves, a cylindrical spike, which is the flower head, and a teriti scape, which basically means when you cut a cross section through it, it's cylindrical. And as you can imagine, this is not really practical, especially when you're referring to plants all the time, like we are. And the history goes back quite a long time ago, actually. In fact, one of the earliest works was back in 300 BC, when this work called Historia Plantarum, it was kind of the first basic works that described plants, and it listed, I think, about 500 species in there, all with these really long descriptions. And it wasn't until the great naturalist Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s who really transformed this world by adopting what he called a binomial approach. And what that basically means is a two-named approach to naming plants. And when this work was published, Species Plantarum as it was known, it was the most methodical naming system that had been devised ever. And this was really the birth of plant taxonomy. So here he is, the man himself, who coined basically naming as it is today, not only for plants, but for all organisms on Earth. So really exciting times back then. But you might be wondering, why scientific names? Well, a lot of you probably know plants have common names, and there are advantages to having common names, but there are also many disadvantages. And a few of the disadvantages are that they vary from one region to another, and also the fact that one particular species might have several common names, or alternatively, one common name might refer to many species. And a good example of that is bittersweet, which is a common name for, I think, at least 5 or 6 different plants all over the world. So you can see how common names have kind of some disadvantages. However, if you're getting familiar with plants and plant names, and kind of for a beginner audience, it can be really useful. So that's also important to consider. So the scientific names, really, the system represents a universal language for plants. And Havard, did you want to mention a bit about this model of language evolution?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting in that, language in general, they are constantly evolving. I mean, some of you probably looked at urban language. There are new things and new meanings applied to new words all the time. And that is, of course, happens to plants as well. And that's why the common names are a bit of a challenge to keep track of. So hence, the attempt here with scientific names is to have a stable relationship to what the word, how the language is used. I want to also add the challenge here with the fact that it is Latin based originally with Linnaeus and the Western world, but obviously there are other languages that doesn't use the alphabet, and that's a bit of a challenge still. So, but we might go into that a bit further later on. But China and Israel, etc., where you don't use Latin letters.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all towards a language that is understood, hopefully, by everybody. And in order to go into that, it's important to think about how organisms are classified in general, really. And it starts with this hierarchical scheme where at the highest level, you have a domain followed by kingdom, followed by phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So all life on Earth follows this classification pattern. And there are various mnemonics to remember this. And one of them that you may have learned or come across, that I certainly did, was, did King Philip come over for good soup? Well, certainly from his looks in the bottom right, he's definitely excited by that. So let's talk through how that classification scheme works. And we're going to take this example on the bottom right, which is maize, or the sweet corn or popcorn plant. And the domain at the highest rank is in what is known as eukaryotes. So these are multicellular organisms. And then kingdom, there are 4 main kingdoms: plants, animals, fungi, and another one that we won't go into. So it's obviously plants. The phylum or division, as it sometimes is known, falls within flowering plants. So there are non-flowering plants, there are seed-bearing plants, there are spore-bearing plants. These are all quite high-level divisions. The class is Liliopsida, or monocotyledons, which basically means when it grows, it produces a single leaf as it germinates. Another class could be dicotyledons, which produces 2 leaves, but we won't go into that. Order, Cyperales, which includes grasses, sedges, and rushes. So as you can see, we're getting finer and finer in our naming scheme. Family, in this case, it's part of the grass family. The genus, Zea, and the species, Zea maize. So maize is the species. And when it comes to scientific names, this is the basic construct: a genus and a species. So you can see from our popcorn plant that the name comprises two names. So it's a binomial, as Linnaeus himself called his system. So we have the first name, which is the genus. One genus is the singular, the plural is genera, which you may have also heard. And maize is the name given to the species. So at its very simple level, that's what a scientific name is. However, you might have seen some other ranks in the scientific naming scheme as you've either worked at Candide or you've been to a garden centre and bought a plant. And I'm just going to go through a few of those examples. So the first is a subspecies, which is denoted by the abbreviation subsp. So you can see in this example, Rosa caesia, subspecies glauca. And a subspecies usually is a small or naturally occurring population of a species. You might also have a variety, which is denoted by the abbreviation VAR. So here you can see Rosa gallica, var officinalis. And usually a variety is given to a population that has usually quite specific traits that are often linked to the geography in which these plants are occurring. And you might also have a form. And again, you see here from this scientific name here, the form is denoted by F dot. And in this case, the form is normalis. And in the case of forms, usually this is a very specific, a very distinct deviation from some of these other ranks, whereby it often is also color related as well. So these are the kind of some of the ranks that you might see in a scientific name. You might also see some hybrids, and these are usually denoted with a cross sign. Note that it's not the X, but a cross. This is very specific in the world of botanical naming. And so these are often denoted with this cross. And in this example, it's a hybrid genus. And that means that it's a mixture between one genus, which is Crataegus, and another genus, Mespilus. And you can see that the naming convention is often a merge of both of those. So Cratae comes from Crataegus, and Mespilus comes from Mespilus. So often there are clues in the name.
But just a question here, this hybrid is occurring in the wild, isn't it? Or is this completely cultivated hybrid?
Yeah, so some of these are occurring in the wild, but other times they are actually physically created by man. So you can't actually tell that from the name itself, but we might touch on that a bit later. But a good question. The other thing is a species hybrid. So here, these are a hybrid between two genera, but sometimes you get two species that can hybridize. And this is denoted by an X in the middle of that scientific name. And finally, another example, which is fairly rare, but you still might come across it. And that's a graft chimera, which is denoted by a plus. And these are really intriguing plants because they've been physically grafted, which basically means you take a stock of one plant and you take a physical stem of another and you almost tie it together and let the plant grow into something, essentially two plants in one, getting twice the value for your money almost. And again, the naming convention is similar. So here you have a laburnum and a cytisus, and the name denoted with a plus is laburnocytisus. And you can see from the right, this beautiful yellow and pink of these two plants that have been grafted together.
I've got a question on that one. Is that the case for grafted onto rootstock as well?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So it's all following the same premise. They're all chimeras, which basically means two physically almost glued together. They're not obviously glued, but they've been grown together. So you might be thinking, well, that's all as well, but what is a species? And I came across this intriguing depiction which hopefully should explain it slightly more clearly. And you see here are two toads, and when they mate, they produce offspring. And here, another species, a frog, when they mate, they produce offspring. And a species, by definition, is a population that when it does breed, it produces offspring that's fertile. Now, why this is important is, well, when the toad tries to breed with a frog, it might be able to produce something, but it's not going to be fertile, or it might die, or it might have other problems. And therefore, a toad and a frog are completely different species. Now, in the case of animals and plants, it's a little bit more complicated, but hopefully this should give you a bit of an idea of what it means. And it's also interesting, some of you may have come across the horse, donkey, mule example, where you've got a horse and a donkey. They're two different species, and when you cross them, it produces a mule. But the mule is actually, though it might be alive and all well, it can't then produce further offspring, which is why a mule isn't a species in itself. So over to the audience. You see here a range of images. Does anybody know what links all of these together? And this is going to form our next rank that we're going to talk about. Any takers? Apart from being edible.
Max has put on the chat here, brassica.
Yeah, very good. Exactly. So, whoops. They're all, this plant, they all come from Brassica oleracea, which in its wild form is this thing on the left. And this is a good example of our next rank in a scientific name, which is a cultivar or a cultivar group. And in the case of a Brassica, this plant here on the left, over successive generations of the plant and across tens or often hundreds of years, it's been bred for specific purposes. So for its terminal buds, it's been selected for, and that's what gives rise to cabbages. Lateral buds, which means buds on the side of the plant, which is what Brussels are. For its stem, which is where kohlrabi comes from. Leaves, kale. Stems and flowers, which is broccoli. And flower clusters, which is what you eat with your cheese in the form of cauliflower. And this is selective breeding by humans for particular traits. And another good example is that of banana. If you look at the wild ancestor of the banana plant, it's completely inedible. It has these really large, hard black seeds in it. And of course, if you tried to eat that, you'd probably hurt yourself. But today we have successively bred those seeds out of the banana into something a lot more tasty and interesting. So as I say, these cultivars are often garden plants, so they're often quite ornamental, and they've been produced by breeding and selection for particular traits. For example, it might be the flower color, or the size of the plant, or the size of the flower. Or it basically can be any desirable characteristics. And in terms of a scientific name, these are actually denoted in single quotation marks. So you can see here the Cryptomeria japonica, you've got the genus, the species, and elegans is the cultivar name. And again here, osteospermum, pink whorls, that's your cultivar. So it's often very easy to detect the parts of the scientific name once you start deconstructing them. What's more interesting is actually these names are given with a purpose, and there can be various reasons why a plant might have a particular name. It could be geographical. For example, vallis, here, this plant occurs in valleys, which is what vallis is the Latin for. Prunus lusitanica is a plant that originates from Portugal and Spain, which is the old world Lusitania. It might also be related to color. So albus means white. You can see that the flowers are white, and caeruleus, which means blue in this case. or it could also be descriptive. For example, Prunus spinosa has these really large thorns, black thorn, which some of you may know it. And this one, for the spider lovers out there, if Kat's on the call, she'll love this one. Calceolaria arachnoidea, which is named after these really fine silky hairs on the flower. So they all have a purpose, which is what makes it fun. But as well as having fun, there's also set rules, and these are governed by an international code for nomenclature. And basically, this is a global body that ensures that plants have only one name that's accepted worldwide. And there's also a separate code specifically for cultivated plants. And as I said, there are some strict formatting rules with scientific names. And that means that when you see a plant name, you can start to deconstruct it, and you can start to parse the various components of it, making it easy, hopefully, to understand what's being referred to. One question that many people ask is, can you name a species after yourself? Well, the strict answer is no, but others could name them after you if they so wish. And here are a few examples. So Stewartia was a genus that Linnaeus himself named after the Earl of Bute back in the 1700s. Hieracium attenboroughianum requires no explanation, but this plant was only discovered in the Brecon Beacons about 6 or 7 years ago, so very recent. And then Rooseveltia frankliniana, which was a name given by the Smithsonian, actually, not too long ago, and it's a very interesting palm. So there are some really cool and intriguing names out there. And finally, another thing that I wanted to touch on was, how do you say scientific names? So it's also another question that I get asked is, what's the best way, or what's the correct way of saying it? Well, I always tell them, you can say it any way you want, as long as you break down the syllables and you say it with confidence, you're on the right tracks. So, and that means you can say even the basic names, such as Poa fax, to the slightly more complex ones, Acorus gramineus. So as long as you break it down, you're on there, you're on your way there. So, and this little plant here on the right has a mighty name. So is there anyone who's feeling brave and wants to give it a go? Remember, you can say it any way you want. Just say it with confidence.
Dave, you have to mute yourself.
I'll have a go for you.
Okay, go.
Go for it.
Ornithogalum adseptentriones virgentulum.
That is absolutely spot on. Well done. Basically, you did absolutely the right thing. Break it down into its syllables, and you're basically there. As long as I understood what you were saying, more or less, and basically don't do a Hermione, because as long as you say it right, you're doing well. So well done, Mark. I think with the time in hand, it's 26 past. I'm going to end just here and take you to the Pokemon, because it's not just plant names that are cool and geeky, but there are people out there who have classified Pokemon in a similar way to classifying life on Earth. So I've linked it here, do check it out, because it goes into plant-like Pokemon, crustacean-like Pokemon, animal-like Pokemon, and it's all this fascinating evolutionary tree that I urge you to take a look at with that in mind. So that's kind of the first part of the talk. Does anyone have any questions before we go geeky?
There was one question on chat from Helen, but you can repeat it, Helen.
Trust me to ask the slightly inappropriate one, but are there any negative effects to breeding plants that are too genetically similar?
breeding plants.
Yeah, so I'm thinking like, forgive
Yeah.
me if it sounds
No,
very stupid, but you know how we don't breed with our cousins for a reason. I'm thinking the same about trees and plants and things like that. Are there any
It,
similarities or no?
there are similarities in that, although because plants, the genetic system in plants is slightly more complex. So this is why you get all sorts of hybrids and things that we will touch on in a minute. And that still occurs in plants. So you do get problems if they are closely together. But at the same time, because the plant genetic system is so complex, it doesn't quite work in the same way as it does for humans or for animals. So in short, no, there aren't really. Yeah.
Thank you.
but what is interesting, that's a very good question in relation to the work we do now for BDCI and the conservation work, in that, botanic gardens, if they keep on growing the same plants with collecting the same seeds in the garden, the genetic value of that species, those species will degrade over time because they're not subject to, or they're subjected to that environment that's in the garden and not the environment they evolved in. So that's sort of a inbreeding in some way, you might say.
Yeah, exactly. And you sometimes get problems with monocultures that are all the same species or the same cultivar, or selectively bred for a particular trait over thousands of years, that makes them quite vulnerable to things like disease or cold temperatures, for example. So there's kind of that negative effect, if you like, as well to think about.
Yeah, the bananas are threatened for that one reason. Too much. It's just one very specific cultivar and nothing else. And it's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, well, feel free to drop off if you need to. And thanks for that little whistle stop tour. But we shall continue our journey into the process for discovering plants and discovering new species. So typically in the wild, you might go to a rainforest and you might see something that has never been seen before. So what you'd typically do is you'd take a sample, you'd collect it, you'd take some leaves, you'd take some bark, or if it's a tree, some flowers, some fruits, and even some roots, for example. And typically that specimen will get pressed in between some newspapers, dried, and then be sent off to what's known as a herbarium, which is a collection of dried plants. And there, botanists will compare these minute characters, such as like the hairs on the leaves, the shape of the flowers, and the kind of surface of the anthers and the stigma, and all these really detailed characteristics. And they'll compare that with other specimens in the herbarium. And from that information, including things like their DNA and their chemical structure, etc., they'll take all these traits into consideration, and then they'll decide, okay, it's nothing like anything we've seen before or come across, and we'll assign that as a new species. And the process for that usually involves a lengthy description. So all of these individual traits that I mentioned, they'll get written up and usually published in a journal. And there are several dedicated journals out there. One of the example ones I've listed here is called Taxon, the International Journal of Taxonomy, Phylogeny, and Evolution. And usually in that publication, you'll list all of these detailed information and all the tests that you've conducted to confirm that it's a new species. And also, as the describer of that species, you will then become the author for that species description. And often you might have seen this in scientific names. So we'll go back to our popcorn plant example. And often you might see Zea Maize, which is the genus and the species, followed by this curious letter at the end. And this at the end is actually the abbreviation of the scientific name author. So this is the person who first described this species and published it. So in this case, it was Linnaeus, because back in the 1700s, he published a lot of species descriptions in his work. And in fact, as well as I mentioned, publishing a lot of plant names, he also published animal names. And he was the first person to publish the name for a human, Homo sapiens. And importantly, when you do find something new, you have to assign it as a type specimen, which basically means this is the specimen that the species description was written from. This is the archetypal, in this case, oak. And what's funny is that when he published Homo sapiens with his authorship, he assigned himself as the type specimen. So Linnaeus himself, he saw himself as the characteristic archetypal human, which is quite amusing. But once you know that kind of information, the fact that this letter refers to the author, you can then pass the full scientific name and work out what it comprises. So in this very lengthy example, you have the genus, the species, L for Linnaeus, because he was the first one who described this species. And now we know var means variety, and the variety is firmus. And here we've got a few authors. So we've got Maize in brackets, because he was the first one who published it. But then Tar and A. Gray came along and decided it was something else. We'll touch on that. It's called a synonym. But anyway, this is the authorship for the variety. And then there's a form involved as well, which is lucidulus. And then again, it has two components here, Gray and Fern, who are the authors for this form. So you can see, start to build up a very complicated but simple picture of a plant's name. And that's all about scientific name authorships. So moving on from that is, why do plants have multiple names? Well, when a plant gets discovered, me, for example, as the author of that species description, I might assign it to a particular genus. However, Havard might come along and say, actually, I think it belongs to this particular genus, or I think it belongs to this particular family. So you can start to see conflicts almost in opinions of botanists, horticulturalists, and researchers. And that way, somebody else can come along and reassign that plant to a different species or a different genus. And historically, that was done a lot on physical characteristics, like the shape of leaves, the hairs, the kind of shape of the flowers, etc. And now increasingly, this is evolving into more complex methods like DNA-based evidence, or things like biochemistry or pheromones and all sorts of weird and interesting stuff. So the point is that this is getting a lot more complicated than it was 300-400 years ago. And this is why you see names, many names for certain plants. And a good example is this species here, which is what its accepted name is Iris domestica. But actually, historically, it's got, I think, tens and tens of synonyms. And this is because over the years, people have come along and thought, oh, actually, no, it's not a Pardanthus, it's an Ixia. Or actually, no, it's not an Ixia, it belongs in the Gemingia genus, etc. So actually, this is a curious example because people thought it was an orchid at first. So vanilla and epidendrum, they're actually orchids. People thought this was an orchid, but only about 15 years ago, people decided it wasn't an orchid, it's actually an iris. And through things like DNA, there's a lot more objective evidence, basically. So that's a fascinating story of synonyms.
Just a side comment there. I know I've talked to gardeners in America, for example, who are very used to using the word, the Bellamcanda genus, and they refuse to adopt iris. This is not an iris, so they're sticking to the. So that's the kind of problem you also have, in that the synonyms might be, and there might be a sort of evidence-based right name, but people will stick to using the old name because they like it or whatever. So it's messy.
And
It's
habit as
messy.
well.
Sorry?
Like habit as well. I'm just trying to think. Rosie will be able to help here. There's a very common. Is it coleus or something like that that everyone knows and loves, and that's been reclassified? But I'll always know it as coleus.
And the problem is also with nurseries and growers. So you might have trade names that are associated with plants, except from a DNA perspective, there's firm evidence that actually this is an iris, but in the trade they might know it as epidendrum sort of thing. So there's lots of miscommunications, and it can divide people and cause all sorts of heated discussions, if you like. So that's the story of synonyms. So that's why we have synonyms in Candide, in the plant database, and it's a lot more relevant for other institutions and botanic gardens. What we're going to cover finally is the wonderful world of orchids, which is where naming conventions and scientific names gets even more wacky. And the reason for that is because orchids are one of the most diverse groups of plants on Earth. And because of their complex genetics, they can produce hybrids, which are basically crosses between species. And these hybrids, in the case of orchids, are known as grexes, or sometimes greges, which is a plural for grex. And here's an example of how this works. So here are two parents, two different species. So Guaranthe aurantiaca and Guaranthe skinneri. And when those two are crossed, parent one and parent two, they produce this looking thing. And in this case, there's the cross, or the progeny, which is the child, if you like, is written out like this. So Guaranthe, which is the genus, and then Guatemalensis, which is known as the Grex, GX. And the thing with orchids is because they hybridize quite readily, you can start crossing the parent with the progeny. And here we see Guaranthe Havard Ostgaard, and that's what that Grex is known as. And you can also cross with the other parent, and this is known as Tristan Fitch. And these Grex names also have specific formatting rules, and you can usually tell because they're not italics. For example, they have a capital letter and they're usually followed by GX, for example. So that's kind of how it works for orchids, and it can get very complicated indeed. And in fact, the example I've shown is probably as basic as it gets, because there are certain cases where there are all sorts of crosses, back crosses, which is when you're crossing back with the previous generation, and all sorts of things in between. And so the naming conventions for this actually can get very messy, more messy than the naming scheme that we've talked about already, actually. But luckily, there are organizations like the RHS who manage the naming conventions for this, just so it doesn't get completely out of hand. So that's the wonderful world of orchids, and hopefully you won't look at one in the same way again. And Havard and I came up with a really great example that we think should find its way onto the marketplace, because I certainly definitely want one with a name like that.
So here's the name where they haven't actually published the Grex, I suppose. And the Grex apparently means flock, I think, in Latin as well. That helps maybe to make a sort of mental hook for the word. Yeah, so thank you very much. Any final questions?
On that note, I was just going to mention before the questions, there are some great further watching, some really nice links. There's a chap here who's created a long series of videos on the classification of life and how organisms are classified. And Kew Gardens do a series called Beyond the Gardens. And one of the nice videos they have is the future of taxonomy. So the future of naming plants and how they're classified in light of these really detailed techniques that involve things like DNA. So yeah, that's kind of the wonderful world of plants and plant names in a nutshell. And of course, yeah, Havard and I, it goes without saying that we're always available for questions and support if you need to interpret plant names. And this is a plant label that somebody saw on an office door, Homo sapiens var Hortis. It should be Hortis, shouldn't it, for us, Havard?
I think so.
So yeah, thanks very much.
I must do a pitch for this first one, the systematic classification of life. That's a true binge watch candidate. It's I watched quite a few of them, and it's really good. So yeah, thank you very much. I'll stop the recording.